On October 14, 1943, at 11:24 a.m., over central Germany, the bomber formation settled into its final approach altitude, engines droning in perfect mechanical rhythm against a sky that felt more hostile than empty. At 23,000 feet, the air was thin enough to burn the lungs and freeze, exposed skin within seconds. Oxygen masks were already sealed tight to faces, hoses snaking across the aircraft interior like lifelines. Every breath came with a faint hiss, a reminder that without the flow of oxygen, thinking would slow, vision would dim, and consciousness would quietly disappear. No one needed to be told that altitude killed just as efficiently as enemy fire. Inside the cockpit, the pilot stared ahead through layered glass already frosted at the edges. The sunlight up here was harsh and unfiltered, turning clouds below into blinding white terrain and flattening the horizon into something almost unreal. His gloved hands rested lightly on the controls, not gripping, not tense. He had learned long ago that fighting the aircraft only made it unstable. The bomber wanted smoothness, not force. Behind him, the co-pilot monitored engine gauges, oil pressure steady for now, temperatures holding just within tolerances that allowed survival at this height. They had been lucky so far. No flak burst close enough to shake the airframe. No fighters yet. But that luck never lasted long over Germany. The bomber held formation, sliding along an invisible grid in the sky. Dozens of aircraft, each spaced precisely, each trusting the others to stay exactly where they were supposed to be. Formation was protection. Break it, and you died alone. The radio crackled with clipped voices reporting fighters assembling miles out. The words were calm, practice, but everyone heard what mattered most beneath them. Incoming. The first German fighters appeared as specks against the sun, almost impossible to see until they moved. Then they grew rapidly, shapes resolving into sharp wings and spinning propellers, closing with terrifying speed. The bomber gunner began calling bearings, voices overlapping as training took over. The pilot adjusted course slightly, just enough to maintain formation, while presenting the smallest possible profile. He had done this before, many times. He knew that panic at altitude was lethal. Smooth inputs, no sudden movements. The first attack came from below and behind. Cannon shells tore through the air, their impact arriving as violent shudders rather than sound. The bomber jumped as rounds punched into the fuselage. Somewhere aft, metal screamed and insulation burst into white clouds. A gunner shouted that he was hit, but still firing. The pilot held course. German fighters streaked past, looping around for another run. This time they came head-on. The cockpit filled with noise, wind screaming through new holes, alarms barking warnings that blurred together. The co-pilot shouted something about hydraulic pressure dropping. The pilot nodded, eyes never leaving the horizon. Then the cockpit exploded inward. A burst of cannon fire tore through the glass, spraying fragments like knives. The pilot felt the impact before he felt pain, his body jolting violently as something slammed into his chest and shoulder. The world tilted, not from the aircraft, but from his own failing balance. He slumped forward. For a fraction of a second, his hands remained on the controls. Then they went slack. The co-pilot shouted his name, reaching instinctively, grabbing at the pilot's harness as blood spread across flight gear and instrument panels. The bomber lurched slightly as pressure shifted on the yoke. Everyone expected it then. The nose to drop, the wing to dip, the beginning of the spin. It didn't happen. The bomber held level. Not perfectly, but enough. The co-pilot froze, staring at the instruments in disbelief. Airspeed steady, attitude stable, engines still synchronized. The aircraft was flying itself. Behind them, the crew felt it too, not the fall, but the absence of it. No sudden weightlessness, no violent roll, just continued forward motion through thin, frozen air. Another burst of fire ripped through the aircraft, tearing into the nose section, but still the bomber stayed on course. Gunners kept firing, voices now edged with something close to fear, not of dying, but of not understanding what was happening. The co-pilot pulled the pilot back against the seat, checking for signs of life he already knew weren't there. The oxygen mask hung crooked, blood bubbling faintly at its edge. The pilot was dead, and yet the bomber flew on. German fighters pulled away momentarily, reassessing what should have been a kill. A pilotless bomber should have dropped instantly. This one didn't. It stayed locked into formation, stubbornly maintaining altitude as if refusing to acknowledge reality. The co-pilot's hands hovered inches from the controls. If he grabbed them wrong, he could stall the aircraft. If he moved too fast, he could throw them out of formation. If he did nothing, the bomber might keep flying until something changed. But what was holding it steady? That question crept through the cockpit even as another attack began to form outside. Because at 23,000 feet, aircraft do not forgive mystery. And whatever was keeping this bomber airborne was not supposed to exist at all. The co-pilot did not touch the controls right away. The hesitation, measured in seconds, would later save the aircraft from a fate no one inside fully understood at the time. His eyes flicked between the artificial horizon and the altimeter, both steady in a way that felt wrong, almost disrespectful to what had just happened. The bomber was trimmed perfectly for level flight, its elevators balanced, engines synchronized, and power set for cruise. The dead pilot's final inputs, made seconds before his body failed, had locked the aircraft into a fragile equilibrium, one that could survive only if it was not disturbed. Behind the cockpit, confusion spread through the fuselage like a delayed shockwave. The navigator shouted forward, asking why the aircraft hadn't dropped. The bombardier, crouched in the shattered nose, stared through cracked plexiglass at the ground far below, waiting for it to rush up and end the question. It didn't. The bomber cut forward through the thin air, engines droning, as if nothing catastrophic had occurred. Gunners kept firing out of reflex, calling out fighters that no one could see clearly anymore through smoke and frost. Another German fighter slashed past the nose, raking it with machine gun fire. The co-pilot flinched, but still did not move the yoke. Training screamed at him to take control immediately. Every manual said the same thing. If the pilot is incapacitated, assume control. But no manual accounted for a bomber that was flying better without interference than it might with panicked hands on the controls. He forced himself to breathe slowly through the oxygen mask, knowing that hypoxia would cloud judgment faster than fear. At 23,000 feet, even mild excitement could steal clarity. He counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. Then he spoke over the intercom, his voice steadier than he felt, telling the crew the pilot was gone, but the aircraft was still stable. The words sounded unreal as he said them, as if describing someone else's emergency. German fighters regrouped and came again, confused now. A bomber that should have broken formation was still holding position, an unnatural thing in the sky. They attacked from multiple angles, trying to force a reaction. Cannon shells ripped through the wings, shredding aluminum skin, tearing fuel lines that began leaking into the slipstream. Warning lights flared and died. The aircraft shook, but its attitude remained stubbornly level. The co-pilot realized something with growing clarity. The bomber was not truly flying itself. It was flying on momentum and balance alone. Trim tabs held surfaces in place. Engine torque, counter-drag, gravity and lift were locked in a temporary truce. But this truce was fragile. One wrong movement would break it instantly. He finally reached forward, placing his hands lightly on the yoke, not gripping, just resting, feeling the pressure. The controls resisted him gently, almost pushing back, as if the aircraft were warning him not to interfere. He adjusted nothing. He simply felt. Behind him, the navigator crawled forward, shouting that the formation was beginning to drift. The bomber was slipping slightly low and right, barely perceptible but enough that the aircraft beside them had started to pull away. Formation was safety. Lose it, and the fighters would finish them without hesitation. The co-pilot faced an impossible choice. Correct the drift and risk destabilizing the aircraft, or stay hands-off and slowly fall out of formation anyway. He chose the smallest possible movement, nudging the yoke by what felt like a breath. The bomber responded. Not violently, not suddenly, but with a soft, reluctant compliance, leveling again as if it had only been waiting for permission. For the first time since the pilot died, the co-pilot allowed himself to believe the aircraft might be controllable. But German fighters did not allow belief to last long. A Messerschmitt came straight in, guns blazing, rounds hammering into the cockpit area again. Glass shattered fully now, wind roaring into the compartment with brutal force. The co-pilot ducked instinctively, the yoke jerking under his hands for a split second as the aircraft yawed. That was all it took. The bomber dipped hard to the left, nose dropping just enough for airspeed to spike and formation space and collapse. The fragile balance snapped. The aircraft was no longer flying. It was being dragged forward by engines fighting physics. The co-pilot fought the controls now, correcting, counter-correcting, trying to re-establish the trim the dead pilot had left behind. His arms strained, muscles burning, oxygen hissing loudly in his ears. The bomber groaned in protest, but slowly responded, clawing its way back toward level flight. The German fighter overshot, missing the kill by seconds. Silence followed again, broken only by the engines and the howl of air through the destroyed nose. The bomber was wounded, bleeding fuel and altitude, but still airborne. The co-pilot steadied his breathing and realized something that chilled him more than enemy fire. The aircraft had survived because it had been left alone. Now that he was flying it, every decision mattered more than before, because the bomber no longer had a pilot who could die again. And if the co-pilot made one mistake at 23,000 feet, there would be no second chance, and no one left to keep it flying. The bomber began to lag behind the formation in ways no one could ignore anymore. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden drop, no wild roll, just a slow, humiliating separation, like a wounded animal losing the pack by inches at a time. At altitude, inches mattered. German fighters watched for that exact moment. They always did. The co-pilot felt the drag before he saw it. The damaged nose acted like a brake, torn metal vibrating, air spilling where it was never meant to go. Fuel streamed from a punctured line along the wing, atomizing into the slipstream, vanishing into the cold. The engines compensated automatically at first, governors nudging power to maintain speed. But the margin was shrinking. Every gauge told the same story in a different language. He trimmed again, carefully, making adjustments so small they bordered on superstition. The aircraft answered with grudging obedience. The horizon steadied. The altimeter slowed its downward creep. For a few precious seconds, the bomber felt almost normal. Behind him, the bombardier's compartment was chaos. Plexiglass had shattered completely, leaving a jagged, open mouth where the nose should have been. The bombardier clung to a frame, oxygen mask icing over, eyes locked on the sky ahead because looking down invited vertigo, so intense it felt like falling. He reported fighters were forming, high left, out of sun. The co-pilot acknowledged without looking. He didn't need the reminder. At 23,000 feet, oxygen starvation made every movement feel heavier than it was. Hands slowed, thoughts blurred at the edges. He forced himself to narrate silently, airspeed, attitude, power, keeping his mind anchored to present. The next attack came from above. Cannons hammered the wing, tearing through control cables with a sound like fabric ripping under tension. The bomber shuddered and yawed, nose slewing just enough to break the fragile balance again. The co-pilot corrected instinctively, then stopped himself mid-motion, easing pressure as the aircraft threatened to overreact. He had learned something essential now. Force was the enemy. Smoothness was survival. The formation surged ahead, their protective guns now too far to help. The bomber was alone. German fighters sensed it instantly. They did not rush. They circled, patient, confident. A lone bomber at this altitude was a solved problem. They only needed to choose the cleanest angle. The co-pilot's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the strain of holding the aircraft on the edge of a stall without letting it tip. He felt the elevator buffet faintly, a warning whispered through controls. Too slow and lift would fail. Too fast and structural damage might finish what the cannon started. He reduced power slightly, trading speed for stability, then retrimmed. The bomber settled into a shallow descent. Not enough to alarm the crew, but enough to change the geometry of the fight. German fighters overshot again, their closing speed misjudged. For the first time since the pilot died, the bomber dictated something about the engagement. The navigator crawled forward, voice tight. He said they were drifting off course, slipping south of planned route. The co-pilot made a decision without debate. Staying with the formation was no longer possible. Survival now depended on choosing a path that wasn't obvious, one that denied the fighter's easy geometry. He turned the bomber a few degrees, barely perceptible, but enough to angle toward scattered cloud ahead. Not cover, not concealment, just complexity. The kind of complexity fighters hated. A Messerschmitt Dove, firing, rounds punching through the fuselage aft. A gunner went silent mid-call-out. No one asked why. The co-pilot kept his eyes on the instruments, heart pounding so hard he worried it might steal oxygen from his brain. They reached the edge of cloud. The bomber slid into gray, visibility collapsing to nothing. Ice formed instantly along exposed metal, rime crawling across frames and control surfaces. The co-pilot adjusted mixture and prop pitch by memory, fingers numbed to spike gloves. Inside the cloud, the aircraft felt different, less battered, oddly calmer, as if the violence outside could not quite find them. But clouds at this altitude were not sanctuary. Icing built quickly, adding weight, robbing lift. The bomber began to shudder again, airspeed bleeding away. The co-pilot faced another impossible balance. Stay in cloud and risk icing-induced stall, or break out and invite fighters back in. He chose neither, at least not fully. He descended just enough to find thinner moisture, skimming the clouds underside where ice accumulation slowed, but concealment remained partial. The bomber responded, reluctantly but faithfully, engine straining as the altimeter ticked down. Minutes passed like hours. When they finally broke clear, the sky was empty. No fighters, no formation, just blue above, cloud below, and a wounded bomber flying, because it had not yet been told it couldn't. Relief surged through the crew and nearly killed them. The co-pilot felt his focus slip for a heartbeat, exhaustion crashing in now that the immediate threat had faded. The bomber wobbled as his hands relaxed too much, altitude dipping another 100 feet before he caught it. He cursed himself and tightened back into the moment, because the danger hadn't ended. They were deep over enemy territory, leaking fuel, down a pilot, and flying aircraft that required constant, perfect attention to remain airborne. The bomber had not fallen, but it was not safe. It was balanced on a knife edge of physics and fatigue. And as the co-pilot steadied the aircraft again, a colder realization settled in. The pilot's final trim had saved them, but only temporarily. Sooner or later, the bomber would demand something more. And when it did, would the co-pilot still be capable of giving it what it needed to stay in the sky? The bomber flew on, but the effort of keeping it there was beginning to show. The co-pilot felt in his forearms first, a dull, persistent ache from holding pressure, just shy of correction, muscles locked in a state of constant restraint. Every instinct told him to relax his grip, to let the aircraft settle on its own. He knew better now. Left alone too long, the bomber would drift into instability. Touched too roughly, it would punish him for the interference. The balance was no longer theoretical. It lived in his hands. The navigator reported fuel loss worsening. The punctured line had not sealed itself as they'd hoped. Every minute at altitude burned. Fuel they would never get back. The co-pilot did the math without writing it down. Range shrinking, options narrowing. He eased the nose down another fraction, trading altitude for efficiency, knowing that lower air meant more drag and more danger, but also more oxygen, more engine margin, more time before the bomber quietly ran out of breath. Below them, cloud layers thinned and broke apart, revealing patches of land that looked disturbingly calm. Fields, rivers, roads, a world untouched by the violence unfolding just above it. The bombardier stared downward, fighting the pull of vertigo and the thought that if the bomber finally failed, that peaceful ground would be the last thing he ever saw. The radio crackled again, faint, distorted, but unmistakable. Another bomber, somewhere nearby, calling for help. The voice was strained, panicked, breaking in and out. German fighters were still active. The co-pilot felt a flash of helpless anger. They could barely keep themselves in the air. Turning back was impossible. Responding would expose them again. He switched the radio off. The decision felt brutal, almost cowardly, but it was also necessary. The bomber could not afford distraction. The sky demanded focus, not sympathy. As they descended through 21,000 feet, the aircraft behavior changed subtly. Controls grew heavier, more honest. The engines sounded less strained, their rhythm smoothing as thicker air fed them more easily. Oxygen has softened, breaths coming a little easier. The co-pilot felt his mind sharpen, the fog of altitude lifting just enough to think more clearly. But clarity brought new fear. German flak zones lay below, invisible but deadly. At lower altitude, they would trade fighter threat for anti-aircraft fire, shells that did not chase or hesitate, shells that simply waited where they expected bombers to be. The co-pilot adjusted course again, angling away from known batteries, trusting maps drawn by men who might already be dead. A sudden jolt ripped through the bomber, sharp and localized. The aircraft lurched, not violently, but enough to send a ripple of panic through the crew. A flak burst close but not direct. Shrapnel pinged against the fuselage, a metallic rain that sounded almost gentle compared to cannon fire. The co-pilot steadied the yoke, heart hammering, and waited for secondary damage reports. None came. They had been lucky. Again, luck was beginning to feel like a finite resource. The bombardier crawled aft to check on the nose, returning with frostbitten fingers and eyes wide. The forward section was barely holding together, frames exposed, cables vibrating visibly in the wind. Another hard maneuver could tear something free. The co-pilot nodded grimly. He already knew. The bomber was no longer something to be flown aggressively. It was something to be guided, carefully, apologetically, toward survival. Hours seemed to compress into minutes as the aircraft droned onward. No fighters appeared. No flak followed. The skies settled into an uneasy quiet that felt earned and undeserved at the same time. One by one, the crew began to speak again. Not much, just enough to remind each other they were still there. Simple check-ins. Status updates. Nothing emotional. Emotions would wait until the ground. The co-pilot's thoughts drifted, despite his efforts to anchor them. He replayed the pilot's final moments, not the impact, but the calm before it. The trim set just right. The power balanced. The aircraft prepared, unknowingly, for a future without him. It felt less like coincidence now and more like intention. Had the pilot known? The idea lodged in his mind and refused to leave. Pilots adjusted trim constantly, but this had been different, precise, deliberate, as if anticipating turbulence that never came, as if anticipating something else entirely. The co-pilot shook his head slightly, dismissing the thought as exhaustion-induced nonsense. And yet, the bomber crossed into friendlier airspace as afternoon light shifted, shadows lengthening across the clouds. Navigation confirmed it. They were closer now. Not safe, but closer. The crew allowed themselves the smallest measure of hope, the kind that didn't tempt fate by speaking too loudly. Then the controls stiffened again. Not abruptly, not violently, just enough to be wrong. The co-pilot felt resistance where there should have been none, a sluggishness that hinted at something changing deep within the aircraft. He tested gently, rolling a degree left, then right. The response lagged. The bomber corrected itself, but slower than before. He checked the trim. It had shifted, not by much, barely a tick, but enough to break the equilibrium that had carried them this far. His heart rate spiked. The bomber began a slow, almost imperceptible nose-down drift. Airspeed crept upward. Altitude began to fall faster than planned. The aircraft was not diving, but it was no longer content to remain where it was. The co-pilot realized the truth with a chill that cut through fatigue and fear alike. The balance they had been living on was expiring. The pilot's final gift, whatever it had been, was running out. And now the bomber was asking a new question, one that could not be postponed any longer. If the aircraft no longer wanted to stay level, could he force it to, and at what cost? The co-pilot resisted the instinct to fight the controls. He had learned, brutally, that force invited collapse. Instead, he listened to the bomber, feeling the pressure change through the yoke and rudder pedals at a language he was only just beginning to understand. The trim had crept forward again, a fraction at a time, as the vibration and damage were slowly undoing the dead pilot's careful work. The aircraft wanted to descend, not sharply, not yet, but decisively. He counted with the smallest correction he could manage, nudging trim back, easing power down a hair to bleed the excess airspeed without pitching the nose up. The engines responded with a smoother tone, but the nose kept drifting. The bomber was no longer indifferent to gravity. It was negotiating with it and losing ground. Behind him, the navigator reported their position with a voice that tried to sound confident and failed. They were on a line that could still bring them home, but not with much margin. Fuel was a bigger problem now. The leak had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. Every minute they stayed high cost them range they would need later. The co-pilot made the call he had been avoiding. He ordered a gradual descent, controlled, intentional, down to an altitude where the aircraft could breathe and where trim would matter less. It was a concession, but not a surrender. He set a shallow rate and watched the vertical speed settle, keeping it gentle enough that the bomber wouldn't accelerate into instability. As they passed through 19,000 feet, the change was immediate. Control forces softened. The elevator felt honest again. The engine sounded stronger, less strained. Oxygen has quieted, breaths coming easier across the intercom. The crew felt it too, shoulders loosening, voices steadier. The bomber was still wounded, but it was more alive down here. The relief was dangerous. The co-pilot caught himself relaxing and snapped his focus back. Lower altitude meant new threats. Flak belts thickened. Fighters could climb faster to meet them. The cloud cover they had skimmed earlier now lay above them, useless for concealment. They were visible again. The bombardier called out distant puffs, black bursts blooming in the sky ahead. Flak. The co-pilot adjusted course just enough to complicate the math for the gunners below, zigging gently, never sharply. Sharp turns tore at the nose section. Gentle deviations bought time. A burst detonated close enough to slap the aircraft sideways. The bomber lurched, instruments rattling. The co-pilot steadied it, heart pounding, and waited for damage reports. None came. They pressed on. Minutes later, another burst. Closer still. Shrapnel rang against the fuselage like thrown gravel. A warning light flickered and died. The bomber shuddered, but held. The co-pilot clenched his jaw and kept the descent shallow, refusing to give gravity more than it was already taking. The navigator spoke again, this time with something like hope. Friendly fighters had been reported patrolling farther west. Not close enough to promise safety, but close enough to suggest the sky might soon stop trying to kill them. The co-pilot nodded to himself and trimmed again, this time more assertively. The bomber answered, slowly, grudgingly, but the nose steadied. Airspeed stabilized. The vertical speed settled into a manageable line. The aircraft was no longer bleeding equilibrium by the second. Then the controls stiffened once more. Not everywhere, just in pitch. The elevator felt heavy, reluctant, as if something were binding. The co-pilot tested gently. Resistance increased, then eased, then increased again. He felt sweat break cold across his back. Icing, he thought, or a damaged cable shifting under load. Either way, it was getting worse. He made a choice that felt reckless and careful at the same time. He added a touch of power, not to climb, but to reduce control load, and trim nose up a fraction more than he wanted. The bomber responded by smoothing out, the resistance easing. The solution worked. For now, but it came with a cost. Fuel flow spiked. The navigator's next report confirmed what the co-pilot already suspected. At this burn rate, they would be cutting it close, very close. There would be no circling, no second approach. Whatever happened next would have to work the first time. The co-pilot stared ahead, eyes burning, mind racing. He thought again of the pilot's last moments, of the way the aircraft had felt almost serene immediately after his death. The precision of that trim no longer felt accidental. It felt like a message sent forward in time. Hold it steady. Don't fight it. Choose your moment. The bomber flew on, battered and stubborn, carrying men who were running out of room to make mistakes. The ground ahead belonged to them now, but the sky was not finished asking its price. And as the co-pilot adjusted trim yet again, feeling the elevator resist a little more than before, a hard truth settled in. The bomber would let him guide it only so long. Sooner or later, it would demand a final answer. And when it did, would that answer come in the air or at the runway's edge. The bomber crossed the last line on the navigator's map that could still be called enemy territory, though the word cross felt generous. It limped. It negotiated. It persisted. The co-pilot no longer thought in miles or minutes. He thought in control pressures, in the feel of the elevator through gloves stiff with cold and sweat, in the way the aircraft answered when asked politely and resisted when pushed. Fuel gauges crept downward with quiet indifference. One engine began to run slightly rough, not enough to fail outright, but enough to introduce a vibration that traveled to the airframe like a warning. The co-pilot compensated with mixture and prop pitch, coaxing smoothness back where he could, knowing that every adjustment was borrowing against a future he could not see. The crew sensed a shift. Voices over the intercom grew clipped again, practical. The bombardier reported frost forming deeper inside the nose. The navigator said they were close enough that turning back would be pointless, close enough that hope became dangerous if indulged too freely. The gunners, who had gone quiet during the long transit, spoke again, scanning the empty sky that still felt capable of betrayal. The co-pilot began to plan the descent in his head, step by step, though he refused to say the word landing yet. The bomber's nose was fragile. The trim was unreliable. The elevator felt heavier with every correction. Any approach would have to be shallow, deliberate, forgiving. There would be no last-minute adjustments. Whatever configuration he chose would have to be right the first time. He tested the flaps gently, just a notch, then stopped. The aircraft responded with a sluggish pitch change that took too long to settle. He retracted them immediately, heart pounding, and made a mental note. Flaps later. Much later. If at all. The radio crackled with a new voice. Calm, familiar, impossibly reassuring. A friendly controller, calling out headings, weather, runway conditions. The co-pilot answered, his voice steady enough to pass for confidence. He did not mention the dead pilot. He did not mention the damage. He simply requested priority. The controller did not ask why. As they descended through 15,000 feet, the world outside grew larger, more detailed. Fields resolved into shapes. Rivers became lines rather than suggestions. The co-pilot felt gravity return to normal proportions, pressing him into the seat in a way that felt almost comforting. The bomber, for its part, seemed to accept the descent more readily than level flight now, as if it had been waiting for permission to stop pretending it was whole. The elevator resistance worsened. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough to matter. The co-pilot found himself applying more pressure to achieve the same response, muscles straining, breath coming harder. He adjusted trim again and felt only partial relief. The aircraft was asking for something he could not give indefinitely. He glanced at the altimeter, then at the distance remaining. They were committed now. Too low to climb back to safety. Too damaged to divert. The runway ahead was no longer an option. It was the only one. The crew felt it too. No one said it. But the intercom carried a tension that had nothing to do with fighters or flak. This was different. This was gravity, honest and unavoidable. The co-pilot made a choice that felt both reckless and inevitable. He reduced power slightly more than planned, accepting a steeper descent to reduce the load on the elevator. The bomber responded by settling into a smoother glide, the control pressure easing just enough to matter. Airspeed increased, but not dangerously. The balance shifted again, precarious, but usable. The runway came into view. It looked impossibly small. The co-pilot aligned the aircraft carefully, refusing to chase the center line with aggressive corrections. He let the bomber drift, then guided it back with minimal input, hands steady despite the tremor creeping into his arms. He waited longer than doctrine recommended before lowering the landing gear, then did it in stages, listening for confirmation that it had locked. One green light, then another, then the third. The bomber shuddered as drag increased, nose dipping alarmingly before the co-pilot countered with trim and power together. The elevator protested, stiff and uncooperative, but it moved. Barely. The runway rushed closer. The co-pilot eased the nose up a fraction, feeling the controls push back hard now, demanding strength he was running out of. Sweat ran into his eyes. His arms burned. The bomber sank toward the concrete, Descent rate just slightly too high. He could force it. He could pull harder. He didn't. Instead, he reduced power a final notch and let the aircraft settle, accepting a firm landing rather than risking a stall inches above the ground. The bomber hit the runway hard, gears screaming, tires smoking as weight slammed down. The nose dipped violently, then recovered as speed bled away. They were down. The bomber rolled, uneven and loud, shedding speed, fighting to remain straight as damage controls resisted alignment. The co-pilot used rudder more than yoke now, guiding rather than commanding, until finally, blessedly, the aircraft slowed to something manageable. When it stopped, no one moved. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the co-pilot exhaled, long, shaking, and felt the last of the tension drain out his arms all at once. They trembled uncontrollably now, useless, the work finished. The crew began to speak at once, overlapping voices, disbelief breaking through discipline. The bombardier laughed once, sharp and hysterical, then stopped. The navigator simply said they were home, as if repeating it might make it true. The co-pilot unbuckled and stood carefully, legs weak, and turned to look at the empty pilot seat. Only then did the full weight of what had happened settle in. The bomber had not fallen. It had not given up. It had waited, balanced on a decision made seconds before death. As ground crews approached, staring in disbelief at the damage, the co-pilot knew the story would be told and retold, simplified and misunderstood. People would ask how the bomber stayed in the air with no pilot. They would talk about luck, about machines, about miracles. But the truth was quieter. The bomber stayed airborne because someone had prepared it to, and that truth, still incomplete, still unanswered in full, waited deeper in the story. Because one final question remained, one that no one on the ground was asking yet. If the pilot had not made that last adjustment, would the bomber have fallen before anyone realized what had been lost? They shut the engines down one by one, and each silence felt heavier than the last. Metal ticked as it cooled, a sound so ordinary it almost hurt. Ground crews surrounded the bomber, shouting instructions, pointing at damage, moving with urgency that arrived too late to change anything that mattered. The co-pilot stayed in his seat longer than necessary, hands resting on the yoke as if the aircraft might still need him. Only when someone tapped the fuselage and motion did he finally unstrap and stand. His legs nearly gave out. He caught himself on the edge of the instrument panel and laughed once, softly, surprised by the sound. It didn't feel like laughter belonged here, but it came anyway, uninvited, a pressure valve releasing after hours of restraint. He steadied, then climbed down into the aircraft's interior, passing through a world that looked nothing like it had that morning. Wires hung loose. Frames were exposed. Frost clung stubbornly to shaded corners. The nose was almost unrecognizable, a torn open cavity that seemed incapable of holding air, let alone life. Medics climbed aboard, efficient and quiet, checking the wounded first, then moving aft. They paused at the cockpit. One of them glanced at the pilot's seat and then looked away, face tightening. No one asked questions. The answers were already written in blood and metal. Outside, officers arrived. Clipboards appeared. Cameras clicked. Someone began sketching the damage on a pad, arrows pointing at holes that no longer needed explanation. The co-pilot was led away from the aircraft and sat on a crate, a blanket thrown around his shoulders, though he wasn't cold. His hands shook now, visibly, and he let them. There was no reason to pretend anymore. They asked him what happened. He started with facts. German fighters. A head-on pass. Cannon fire through the cockpit. The pilot killed instantly. The bomber maintaining level flight. He spoke slowly, choosing words that wouldn't collapse under scrutiny. Every sentence felt like it needed proof. He described the trim, the balance, the way the aircraft had responded when left alone. Some of the officers nodded. Others frowned, unconvinced. One of them asked the obvious question. How did the aircraft stay airborne? The co-pilot paused. He could have said luck. Everyone accepted that word. It was flexible, comfortable. It didn't demand further explanation. But it wasn't right. Not fully. He thought of the moment after the pilot slumped forward, the unnatural steadiness of the horizon, the way the bomber had seemed to breathe on its own. He said the pilot must have trimmed it perfectly. The officer wrote that down, pen scratching, and moved on. The answer satisfied the report, if not the reality. Later, alone in the barracks, the co-pilot replayed everything with a clarity that hurt. He remembered the pilot's calm before contact, the way he'd adjusted power and trim with unusual care even before the fighters appeared. He remembered thinking, at the time, that it was unnecessary. Now it felt deliberate, almost prescient. Pilots adjusted trim constantly. That much was true, but they didn't usually lock it in so precisely and then leave it untouched. Not unless they expected turbulence, or planned to leave the controls alone for a reason they didn't intend to explain. The thought unsettled him. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it did, it brought fragments. Instrument needles frozen in place, a horizon that refused to tilt, a bomber flying on without anyone at the controls. He woke before dawn, heart racing, oxygen echoing in his ears, even though the mask was gone. The next day, intelligence called him in again. This time, the questions were narrower, sharper. They wanted timing, exact altitude, airspeed at the moment of impact, trim settings, if he remembered them. He closed his eyes and pictured the panel as it had looked. Burned, cracked, smeared with blood, and answered as accurately as he could. One officer leaned back and folded his arms. He asked whether the co-pilot believed the pilot had anticipated being killed. The room went quiet. The question felt almost obscene, as if it accused the dead of something. The co-pilot shook his head immediately. No one anticipated death. Not like that. Not consciously. But preparation was another matter. Pilots lived in a world where failure had no patience. They prepared for engine loss, for flak, for fire. They prepared for their own mistakes. Did they prepare for being removed from the equation entirely? He said he didn't know. The officer nodded slowly, as if that answer mattered more than certainty. He closed the folder and stood, signaling the end of the interview. As the co-pilot left, he heard the officer murmur something to another man about stability, about trim theory, about how rare it was to see it applied so cleanly under combat conditions. Weeks passed. The bomber was written off. The crew was reassigned. New aircraft, new faces, new missions. The war did not pause to honor improbabilities. The co-pilot flew again, hands steadier now, instincts sharpened by the memory of what thin air and perfect balance could do. But something had changed in him. He paid more attention to trim, to equilibrium, to what happened when an aircraft was left alone. He began trimming not just for comfort, but for absence. Others noticed. A pilot joked about it once, asking if he planned to step out mid-flight. The co-pilot smiled and said nothing. There were things you didn't explain unless asked properly. The stories circulated anyway, not in official briefings, but in whispers. A bomber that flew without a pilot. A crew that survived because the aircraft refused to fall. Each telling added a layer, shaven edge, turned physics into folklore. The co-pilot heard versions that made him uncomfortable. Talk of miracles, of divine hands on controls. He never corrected them, because the truth, he suspected, was stranger and less comforting. Months later, long after the mission had faded into paperwork, he stood on a flight line watching another crew prepare for takeoff. He saw the pilot reach forward and adjust trim, small movements habitual. He wondered how many of them understood what that adjustment could mean later, when hands were gone, when noise and violence erased intention. The bomber they'd flown had not survived because it was strong. It had survived because it was balanced. And balance, one said, could outlast a man who said it. That realization followed him into every cockpit after that, a quiet companion that never quite left. He knew now that survival sometimes depended on decisions made before anyone realized they would matter. And as he watched the aircraft lift into sky and disappear in the cloud, a final, unsettling thought surfaced, one that the war had not yet answered. If the bomber had stayed airborne because of one deliberate adjustment made seconds before death, how many other aircraft had fallen simply because no one thought to prepare for the moment they wouldn't be there to fly them? The idea refused to stay buried. It followed the co-pilot into every briefing, every climb to altitude, every quiet moment when the engines settled into their long, steady drone and the sky stretched empty ahead. He began to notice how casually most crews treated trim, how it was adjusted for comfort and then forgotten, trusted implicitly to behave the same way forever. He watched pilots rest their hands lightly on the yoke during long transits, confident that they could always correct whatever came next. Confidence, he had learned, was not the same thing as preparation. On a mission weeks later, climbing through broken cloud toward cruising altitude, he felt the old tension return, not fear, but awareness. The bomber's pilot chatted over the intercom, relaxed, joking about weather and coffee waiting on the ground. The co-pilot listened, half present, half focused on the instruments. He watched the trim indicators, the subtle relationship between power, pitch, and airspeed. When the pilot finished adjusting and settled in, the co-pilot quietly rechecked the balance, making a micro-adjustment so small it barely registered. The pilot noticed and raised an eyebrow. The co-pilot shrugged and said it made the aircraft feel calmer. The pilot laughed and let it go. Later that day, German fighters attacked from the sun, fast and vicious. The bomber shook under the first impacts, metal screaming, alarms flaring. The pilot reacted sharply, correcting hard, then easing off as the aircraft threatened to overrespond. For a moment, control teetered. Then it settled. The co-pilot felt it immediately, the way the aircraft resisted chaos, just long enough to buy them time. They survived the engagement with damage, but without catastrophe. Afterward, as they droned home, the co-pilot didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The pilot was quieter now, thoughtful, glancing more often at the trim panel, as if seeing it for the first time. Story spread faster than doctrine ever could. Not orders, not instructions, just habits passed from one crew to another. A little more care before contact. A little more respect for balance. Pilots began trimming with intention, not superstition. No one talked about flying without a pilot. They talked about making aircraft forgiving, about giving themselves seconds they might not otherwise have. The co-pilot never claimed credit. He didn't want it. What he carried wasn't pride, but responsibility that felt heavier with time. He had seen what happened when preparation outlived the preparer. He had felt the edge where physics and human limits met, and decided who stayed airborne. Then came another mission, deeper this time, into airspace where flak stitched the sky into black, bursting patterns, and fighters prowled like sharks. The bomber took hits early, not catastrophic, but cumulative. Systems failed one by one. Each lost narrowing options. The pilot was wounded, not killed, but slowed. Blood soaked into his glove, his movement stiffening. The co-pilot watched the trim indicators as the pilot fought through pain, keeping the aircraft steady by force where finesse would have been safer. He leaned forward and spoke quietly, suggesting a small adjustment. The pilot nodded, made it, and immediately the aircraft's behavior changed, smoother, more obedient. The pilot exhaled sharply, surprised. They limped home again. Another survival that would never be written as anything more than aircraft returned damaged. That night, the co-pilot sat alone on a bunk and realized something unsettling. The lesson he had learned was spreading, but without context. Crews were copying the action, not the understanding. They were trimming more carefully, yes, but some of them believed it was a charm, a guarantee. They believed balance could replace judgment. He knew better. Balance bought time. Nothing more. Time to act. Time to decide. Time to leave, if leaving was required. The war had not changed its rules. It had only revealed how thin they were. When he was finally asked to explain what he had seen, he chose his words carefully. He said trim was not about making an aircraft fly by itself. It was about making it honest, about letting it tell you what it needed instead of fighting it into silence. Some listened, some nodded and forgot. That was the way of things. Months passed. Losses mounted. Victories blurred together. The bomber that had flown without a pilot became a rumor that drifted between units, changing shape as it went. Some said it had flown for hours. Others claimed it had landed itself. The truth, precise and fragile, was harder to hold on to than myth. The co-pilot carried it anyway. And then, one evening, as he reviewed mission notes after landing, he noticed something in a report from another group. A bomber hit in the cockpit. Pilot killed. Aircraft maintained level flight long enough for the co-pilot to take control. The wording was dry. The implications were not. He stared at the page for a long time. The story was repeating, not exactly, but close enough to matter. That night, lying awake with engines still humming his ears, he understood that what happened was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern, fragile and incomplete, but real. A sliver of survivability carved out of chaos, by intention rather than chance. And that realization brought with it a new, heavier question, one that went beyond a single bomber or crew. If this knowledge spread far enough, would it save lives? Or would it give men a false confidence that no amount of trim could ultimately protect them from? The report did not leave the co-pilot's mind. He carried it with him into the next briefing, into the climb through cloud, into the thin, bright air where bombers lived and died by fractions. Another aircraft, another cockpit hit, another few minutes of level flight, where there should have been none. It was not identical to what he had lived through, but it rhymed closely enough to be unsettling. Patterns in war were never comforting. They meant something was changing, or something had always been there, and was only now being noticed. On that mission, the sky felt watchful, not hostile, alert. The bomber settled into cruise with steadiness the co-pilot now recognized as a language. He checked the trim again, then again, not because it needed it, but because attention had become a habit. The pilot glanced over once, a question in his eyes. The co-pilot answered with a nod that said everything was fine. It was, for the moment. Fighters came later and not in force. A probing attack. A few fast passes at tested reactions and measured spacing. The bomber shook, but nothing vital failed. The pilot handled it well. Correction smooth. Restraint learned the hard way by men who flew long enough to learn it. When the fighters peeled away, the co-pilot felt the familiar drop in tension and the danger that came with it. He forced himself to stay present. Survivors died in the minutes after survival, when focus drifted, after landing. The co-pilot sought out the intelligence officer who had asked him the uncomfortable question weeks before. The man listened without interrupting as the co-pilot described a new report. The similarities. The way crews were starting to talk about trim with a seriousness that felt new. When the co-pilot finished, the officer leaned back and stared at the ceiling, fingers steepled. He said this was how doctrine began. Not in classrooms, not in manuals, but in stories that refused to be dismissed. He said the danger was not that crews would learn the wrong lesson, but that they would learn half of it, that they would mistake preparation for protection, that they would forget the part where judgment still had to be exercised under pressure. The co-pilot agreed. He said balance was not immunity. It was a window, and windows closed. The officer nodded and asked him to write everything down, everything he could remember, everything it inferred, everything he feared would be misunderstood. The co-pilot went back to his quarters and wrote until his hand cramped, pages filling with careful descriptions of feel and response, of the way an aircraft spoke through resistance and lag, of how trim could hold a line only as long as the air allowed it. He wrote about oxygen and fatigue, about how altitude lied to mind. He wrote about the moment when force had to be resisted, not applied. He did not write about miracles. Weeks later, a memo circulated quietly. It was not an order. It was suggestion, couched in cautious language. Crews were encouraged to consider trim and balance as part of pre-contact preparation. Pilots were reminded to avoid over-controlling at altitude and to allow the aircraft to settle before making corrections. The language was conservative, almost timid. But the idea was there. Something had shifted. The co-pilot watched how crews received it. Some nodded and moved on. Some took it to heart. A few misunderstood it entirely, treating trim like a talisman. He intervened when he could, pulling men aside to explain that balance was not about walking away from the controls. It was about buying time to make better decisions. Some listened. Some smiled and said, sure, then did what they had always done. War selected its students harshly. On a cold morning months later, the co-pilot flew with a new pilot, young, competent, eager. During the climb, the pilot trimmed aggressively, chasing a feeling rather than a number. The aircraft oscillated slightly, Never enough to be dangerous, but enough to signal impatience. The co-pilot waited, then suggested a different approach. The pilot bristled for a second, then tried it. The bomber settled. The pilot's shoulders dropped. Later, fighters attacked. Not many. Enough. The cockpit filled with noise and vibration. The pilot reacted sharply, then remembered, ease off, let the aircraft speak. The co-pilot felt the steadiness return, thin but real. They took damage and survived. On the ground, the pilot said nothing, but his eyes lingered on the trim panel longer than before. Not every lesson stuck. Not every flight returned. The co-pilot attended too many brief memorials, heard too many names spoken with care. He read reports that ended in sterile phrases, and imagined the seconds they hid. He wondered how many times a perfectly trimmed aircraft had been lost because someone fought it at the wrong moment. He wondered how many times preparation had been in place, but judgment had failed. The bomber that flew without a pilot became a touchstone. Not a myth, an example. A narrow one. The co-pilot resisted the urge to let it become more than it was. He corrected men when they exaggerated. He insisted on limits. He repeated, again and again, that trim did not save lives by itself. People did, by knowing when to let go and when to take hold. Late in the season, he was asked to speak to a small group of instructors. Not to lecture, just to talk. He told the story plainly, stripped of drama. He emphasized the moments of hesitation, the choices that could have gone the other way. He spoke about the pilot's last seconds without attributing foresight or fate. He said the pilot had been doing his job well, and that competence had consequences beyond the moment. An instructor asked him what he would teach if he could teach only one thing. The co-pilot thought for a long time. Then he said this: teach men to recognize when the aircraft is working with them and when it isn't. Teach them to tell the difference between control and struggle. Teach them to respect a thin line where intervention helps and where it hurts. The instructor wrote that down. On the flight back to quarters that evening, the co-pilot watched the sunset smear the horizon in colors that did not belong at altitude. He thought of the first minutes after the pilot died, the steadiness that had felt wrong, the balance that had felt intentional. He understood now that the story's power lay not in the impossibility of it, but in its restraint. Nothing supernatural had happened. Physics had simply been given a chance to behave. That understanding did not bring comfort. It brought responsibility. Because once you knew that survival could hinge on a decision made before disaster, you could never unknow it. You could never stop asking whether you were prepared enough, whether you had left the aircraft honest enough to carry you through the moments when you might not be there to help it. As the bomber leveled and the engine settled into their long, patient song, the co-pilot rested his hands lightly near the yoke, not on it, and watched the horizon hold. The question that rose then was not about the past, or even about the war. It was about what came next. If knowledge like this spread quietly, unevenly, and perfectly, would it change the outcome of future fights? Or would it simply shift where the line between survival and loss was drawn? The war began to tilt toward its end not with celebration, but with exhaustion. The tempo changed. Missions were still flown, targets still assigned, but something had shifted beneath the surface. Crews talked less about victory and more about finishing. Finishing the tour. Finishing the week. Finishing the flight they were currently on. Survival had narrowed its focus. The co-pilot felt that narrowing keenly. He had flown long enough now that the sky no longer felt infinite. It felt measured, counted. Every takeoff carried an invisible number beside it. How many were left before probability caught up? On one late winter mission, climbing through broken cloud, the bomber encountered heavy turbulence. Nothing violent, but persistent, the kind that wore at nerves and loosened fittings. The aircraft rode it unevenly, pitch rising and falling despite careful inputs. The pilot corrected, then overcorrected. The bomber began to oscillate in a way that felt familiar and dangerous. The co-pilot spoke calmly, suggesting trim changes rather than control input. The pilot hesitated, pride flickering, then complied. The aircraft settled. The turbulence remained, but its power over them diminished. They rode through, engine steady, formation intact. Later, after landing, the pilot admitted something quietly. He said his first instinct had been to fight the aircraft harder, to force it back into obedience. He said that instinct felt right, strong, decisive. He said it scared him how wrong it would have been. The co-pilot nodded. He had felt the same fear. Strength was comforting. It gave the illusion of control. But at altitude, illusion killed faster than hesitation. As winter dragged on, bomber losses slowed. Not dramatically, not miraculously, but enough to be noticed by men who lived in statistics. There were many reasons. Improved escorts, better tactics, enemy shortages. But among crews, another explanation circulated quietly, half-formed, rarely spoken aloud. Aircraft were being treated differently. Not babied, not feared. Listened to. The co-pilot saw in the way pilots trimmed before contact now, in the way they paused after damage, instead of reacting instantly. He saw it in the restraint that followed panic, the moments where hands loosened instead of tightened. These changes didn't guarantee survival. Nothing did, but they created spaces where survival could still be chosen. Then came a mission that nearly erased all of that progress. The bomber took a flak hit just below the cockpit, a brutal impact that sent fragments slicing to the control area. The pilot screamed, not from pain but shock, as blood spread across his sleeve. The aircraft lurched, nose dipping sharply. The co-pilot grabbed the controls reflexively, then stopped himself mid-motion, feeling the aircraft's resistance spike. For a heartbeat, everything balanced on instinct alone. He remembered the first bomber, the dead pilot, the level horizon that should not have existed. He eased pressure instead of increasing it. The bomber responded, settling into a rough but flyable attitude. The pilot, breathing hard, stared at the instruments in disbelief. The co-pilot guided his hand back to the yoke, helping him regain feel rather than seizing control outright. Together, they coaxed the aircraft back into something stable. They survived that mission too. Afterward, the pilot found the co-pilot alone and thanked him, not loudly, not ceremonially, just once. He said that in the moment of the hit, everything in him had wanted to pull, to fight gravity with strength. He said he had felt himself about to overdo it. He said the pause had saved them. The co-pilot accepted the thanks without pride. He knew the truth. The pause had only been possible because of everything that came before it. Preparation did not replace courage. It gave courage somewhere to land. As spring approached, the co-pilot was rotated off combat duty. The news came quietly, almost anticlimactically. One more flight, then ground assignment. He felt relief, yes, but also unease. Leaving the sky felt like stepping away from a conversation that was still unfinished. On his final flight, he watched the pilot adjust trim with care, then check it again after leveling off. The aircraft felt calm, almost docile. The co-pilot rested his hands near the yoke, not touching, and let himself breathe. No fighters came that day. No flak, just clouds and sun, and the long hum of engines doing what they were built to do. After landing, he climbed down from the bomber and stood on the tarmac longer than necessary, looking back at the aircraft that carried him through so much. He ran a hand along the cold metal skin, feeling dents and patches beneath his fingers, evidence of moments when the sky had demanded payment and been negotiated with instead. He knew the war would end soon. He knew reports would be written, lessons formalized, theories debated. He also knew that the most important parts of what he learned would never translate cleanly onto paper, because the truth was not a rule. It was a feeling, the feeling of when to act, the feeling of when to wait, the feeling of when balance was holding, and when it was about to break. As he walked away from the aircraft for the last time, the co-pilot understood that the story of the bomber that didn't fall was no longer just about one impossible flight. It was about how men adapted quietly, imperfectly, learning to survive not by dominating machines, but by cooperating with them under unimaginable pressure. And still, even now, the final mystery lingered, unanswered, unresolved, waiting for history to catch up to it. Because when that pilot adjusted trim moments before death, he could not have known what would follow. Or could he? The question followed him into civilian airfields and quiet classrooms long after he stopped wearing a flight jacket. It followed him because no one ever answered out loud. Not officially, not in reports or lectures or the carefully sanitized histories that came later. The idea that a man might unknowingly set the conditions for survival after his own death made people uncomfortable. It suggested foresight where randomness was supposed to rule. It suggested that preparation could echo beyond presence. Years earlier, during the war, the co-pilot would have dismissed that thought as superstition. Now, with distance and memory working together, he could no longer do that honestly. He remembered too clearly how deliberate the pilot's final movements had been. Not rushed, not panicked, balanced, as if the aircraft mattered even without him. The more he thought about it, the more the pieces aligned. Experienced pilots did not trim casually in hostile airspace. They trimmed for workload, yes, but also for fatigue, for turbulence, for the unexpected. A perfectly balanced aircraft reduced effort, reduced error. It brought mental clarity. That was known. What wasn't often acknowledged was what happened when the pilot was suddenly removed from the loop. The aircraft didn't panic. It didn't mourn. It continued doing exactly what it had been told to do last. The bomber had not stayed airborne because it was brave. It stayed airborne because it had been instructed to. During the final months of the war, this realization quietly reshaped how some crews prepared for missions, not in any official sense. No memos announced it, but habits changed. Pilots trimmed deliberately before danger zones. Co-pilots paid closer attention to how the aircraft behaved when untouched. There was an unspoken understanding that sometimes survival depended on what you set in motion before chaos arrived. The co-pilot, now reassigned to training, began watching new crews with a different eye. He noticed which pilots fought the aircraft and which let it fly. He noticed who trusted force and who trusted balance. He intervened rarely, but when he did, it was precise. He didn't tell stories. He asked questions. How does it feel when you let go? Most pilots hesitated before answering. Some didn't understand a question at all. One afternoon, after a long session in the air, a young pilot admitted something quietly. He said that when the aircraft was trimmed just right, it felt like it wanted to stay alive. The co-pilot nodded. That was closer than most ever got. But even as the idea spread, uneven and fragile, the co-pilot knew it would never become doctrine in the way people expected. Militaries preferred rules that could be written, enforced, measured. This was none of those things. It lived in intuition and restraint, in moments that could not be rehearsed. That made it dangerous. Men might misunderstand it. They might think balance replaced vigilance. They might believe preparation alone could save them without judgment. The co-pilot worried about that more than he worried about ignorance. Ignorance could be corrected. False confidence could not. The war ended officially soon after. Parades followed. Medals were handed out. Aircraft were mothballed or scrapped. The bomber that had refused to fall was dismantled quietly, its story already blurring into myth. No plaque marked it. No ceremony acknowledged the moment it carried men forward, without anyone at the controls. The co-pilot visited the airfield where it had landed one last time before returning home. The runway looked smaller than he remembered. The sky above it looked impossibly peaceful. He stood there for a long while, hands in his pockets, replaying the sound of engines settling, the feel of resistance in the controls easing just enough to matter. He realized then that the mystery had never really been about the bomber. It had been about responsibility. The pilot's last adjustment had not been an act of foresight or fate. It had been competence, carried to its logical conclusion. He had done his job so well that his effects extended beyond his presence. That was all, and yet it was enough. Years later, historians would debate the incident. Engineers would argue about trim forces and stability margins. Some would dismiss the story entirely, calling it exaggerated. Others would insist it proved something fundamental about aircraft design. None of them would fully capture what it felt like inside that cockpit at that altitude, in that silence after death, because what kept the bomber flying was not a mechanism. It was a relationship between man and machine that had been shaped long before the first shot was fired. And that relationship carried forward, unnoticed, until someone else had the chance to take hold of it. The co-pilot understood now why the question still lingered, not because the answer was hidden, but because it was uncomfortable. if preparation could outlive the person who prepared, then responsibility did not end with survival. It extended into the unknown, into moments you would never see, into outcomes you would never witness. And that thought demanded a final reckoning. If one man's quiet competence could keep a bomber flying after his death, what other unseen decisions were still shaping outcomes long after the people who made them were gone? The question stopped feeling theoretical when the co-pilot began reading accident reports from peacetime flights years later. Different aircraft, different skies, no enemy fire. And yet, threaded through some of them was a familiar pattern. Aircraft that remained stable long enough after sudden pilot incapacitation for someone else to intervene, or long enough to reduce a disaster from catastrophic to survivable. These were not miracles. They were margins. Thin ones, quiet ones, bought by decisions made earlier, often without drama, often without recognition. He realized then that what he had witnessed during the war was not an anomaly of combat, but an extreme example of a universal truth. Machines do exactly what they are last told to do, until physics tells them otherwise. Humans, by contrast, are removed suddenly, by violence, by fatigue, by error. The space between those two realities was where survival sometimes hid. During his time as an instructor, he began framing lessons differently. He no longer spoke only about recovery from failure. He spoke about preparing for absence. The idea unsettled some pilots. Aviation culture prized control, presence, authority. Suggesting that an aircraft should be ready to behave safely without its pilot felt almost like admitting weakness. But weakness was not the right word. Humility was. He asked pilots to imagine not dying, but disappearing. Hands gone, voice silent. Decision-making removed in an instant. What would the aircraft do then? Would it climb? Descend? Roll gently or violently? Would it give the next person a chance? Or would it demand perfection from someone already behind? Those who understood changed how they flew. Not dramatically. Subtly, they trimmed with intention. They avoided leaving aircraft on the edge of instability simply because they could manage it. They respected the idea that control was something you could prepare for others to inherit. The co-pilot knew this thinking would never become universal. It was too quiet, too dependent on judgment. But it didn't need to be universal. It only needed to exist in enough minds to matter. He was invited once to speak to a group of engineers working on post-war aircraft designs. They asked about the bomber incident, about stability, about trim authority. He answered their questions carefully, but he added something they hadn't expected. He said that stability was not just about keeping an aircraft straight. It was about buying human time, about forgiving delay, about giving the next decision a chance to exist. Some of them nodded. Others frowned. Engineers like numbers. This was harder to quantify. As the years passed, the story of the bomber that didn't fall faded further into obscurity. New wars, new machines, new myths replaced it. But the co-pilot carried it intact, unchanged by repetition. He told it only when asked properly, when someone seemed ready to hear the part that mattered. He never framed the pilot as a hero in the dramatic sense. He framed him as competent, thorough, calm under pressure. A man who had done his job so well that the consequences extended beyond his own life. That framing made people uncomfortable. Heroism was easier to digest than responsibility. On a quiet afternoon decades later, standing near a small airfield where civilian aircraft came and went, the co-pilot watched the plane take off and settle smoothly into climb. He noticed the way it held its attitude even as the pilot's hands relaxed. The aircraft wanted to fly. Someone had allowed it to. The memory of that October morning returned then, not as fear but clarity. The frost on the glass, the silence after the shot, the horizon that refused to tilt. He understood now that the bomber had not been defying death. It had been obeying instruction. The final reveal, the one that had waited patiently since the beginning, crystallized fully in his mind at last. The bomber didn't stay airborne because the co-pilot saved it. It didn't stay airborne because of luck. It stayed airborne because, moments before he died, the pilot had unknowingly made the aircraft survivable without him. He had trimmed not for comfort, not for ease, but for neutrality, for a state where the bomber would neither climb nor dive, neither fight nor fall, if left alone. In doing so, He created a narrow corridor in time, a corridor wide enough for another man to step into. And that was the truth hidden beneath every retelling. Not magic, not fate, just preparation carried to its quiet extreme. Only one question remained now, one that closed the circle and refused to let the story rest. If survival sometimes depended on preparing for the moment you would no longer be there, what responsibilities did that place on every decision made before the crisis even began? The responsibility weighed heavier than any metal ever could. Once the co-pilot understood it fully, he could not unknow it, and that knowledge reshaped how he viewed every cockpit, every checklist, every small decision that seemed insignificant in isolation. He realized that most fatal moments were not born in explosions or impacts, but in earlier minutes when no one believed anything was at stake yet. Before the crisis, before the noise, before the urgency. That was where outcomes were quietly negotiated. He saw it in peacetime accidents now, reading between the sterile lines of investigation summaries. Aircraft that departed trimmed aggressively nose up because the pilot liked the feel. Machines left slightly unstable because constant correction felt reassuring. Flights that were survivable in theory, but unforgiving in reality, because the margin for absence had been erased long before anything went wrong. The bomber at 23,000 feet had been different. Its pilot had not prepared for death. He had prepared for workload, for fatigue, for the strain of flying damage through hostile air. But preparation, the co-pilot now understood, did not care why it existed. It only cared that it did. When the pilot was removed from the equation, the preparation remained, quietly doing its job without needing permission or recognition. That idea unsettled people when he shared it. They wanted to believe survival was reactive, that the right move at the right moment saved you. They wanted heroism to live in seconds, not habits. But the co-pilot knew better. The decisive moment often arrived already shaped by what came before it. Reaction mattered, yes, but reaction was limited by the conditions it inherited. He watched young pilots rush through pre-flight routines, confident in their ability to handle it if something happens. He heard that phrase often, handle it, as if skill alone could bend physics when time ran out. Sometimes he challenged them gently, asking what the aircraft would do if they couldn't handle it, if they were distracted, injured, or simply overwhelmed for a few seconds. Most had never considered the question. During one training flight, he asked the pilot to let go of the controls for just a moment while trimmed for cruise. The pilot hesitated, then did it. The aircraft held steady, almost indifferent. The pilot laughed, relieved. The co-pilot didn't smile. He asked what would happen if the aircraft had been trimmed differently, if it had required constant correction to stay level. The pilot grew quiet. That silence was the beginning of understanding. The co-pilot came to see the bomber incident not as an extraordinary story, but as a warning disguised as a miracle. It showed what was possible, but also what was usually missing. Most aircraft fell when pilots died because they were never given a chance to do anything else. They were left unstable, demanding, unforgiving. When the human element vanished, so did the margin. The bomber that didn't fall had been given a margin, and margins, once understood, changed everything. This realization crept beyond aviation in the co-pilot's mind. He saw it in other systems too, complex machines, organizations, even people. The most resilient ones were not those controlled most tightly, but those prepared to remain functional when control faltered. They did not rely on constant correction. They were built to endure moments of absence. Years passed. The war became history. The story of the bomber faded further, reduced to a footnote if it was remembered at all. But the lesson remained alive wherever someone understood that survival often depended on what you left behind, not what you did in the final moment. The co-pilot grew older. His hand shook slightly now, no longer from exhaustion or adrenaline, but from time. He no longer flew, but he still watched the sky with familiarity that never left. Every aircraft he saw carried people who believed they would be there to the end. Most of the time, they would be right. Sometimes they wouldn't, and that was why the lesson mattered. One evening, sitting alone, he returned again to the image that had started everything, the horizon that refused to tilt after the pilot died. He realized that the mystery had never been why the bomber stayed airborne. The mystery was why that outcome was so rare. Because the truth was uncomfortable. It meant that survival was often decided before danger announced itself. It meant that responsibility extended beyond presence. It meant that what you prepare for others to inherit could matter more than what you plan to control yourself. And that understanding led him to one final, unresolved thought, one that pointed beyond the war, beyond aircraft, beyond even individual lives. If resilience depended on preparing systems to survive without their operators, how many disasters, past and future, were sealed long before anyone realized a moment to act had already passed? By the time the co-pilot reached the end of his life, the world had changed in ways he could never have imagined while sitting at 23,000 feet inside a shattered bomber. Aircraft flew higher, faster, guided by computers and layers of automation that would have sounded like science fiction during the war. Pilots now shared control with machines that could hold altitude, heading, and balance with precision no human could match for long. And yet, the old question had not gone away. If anything, it had become more dangerous. Because automation did not remove responsibility. It moved it earlier in time. The co-pilot followed these developments from a distance, reading articles, listening to debates, watching investigations unfold after accidents that baffled the public. Once again, people searched for the moment of failure. A switch flipped. A pilot reacted too late. A system disengaged unexpectedly. But the co-pilot recognized a familiar shape beneath those explanations. The decisive moment had already happened. It had happened when systems were configured, when assumptions were accepted, when balance was traded for convenience. Modern aircraft could fly themselves, but only within the boundaries humans defined for them. If those boundaries were narrow, brittle, or poorly understood, the result was the same as it had been in 1943, when humans were suddenly removed from the loop by confusion, overload, or absence. The machine simply continued doing what it had last been told to do. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. The co-pilot thought back to the bomber again, to the fragile neutrality the pilot had unknowingly created. A state where the aircraft neither demanded immediate correction nor punished inattention. It had not been optimized for performance. It had been optimized for survival. That distinction felt more important now than ever. He saw parallels everywhere. Systems designed to run perfectly under constant supervision, but collapsed when supervision faltered. Organizations that relied on heroic intervention instead of resilience. People who believed they would always be present when their systems were tested. They rarely were. In quiet conversations, when asked what lesson from the war mattered most, the co-pilot no longer spoke about combat or courage. He spoke about preparation for absence, about designing decisions that could survive you, about leaving behind stability instead of dependence. Most listeners nodded politely and moved on. A few stopped and thought. Those were the ones who mattered. In his final years, the co-pilot returned one last time to an airfield, now modernized, its runways longer, its control tower bristling with antennas. He watched an aircraft depart smoothly, rotate, and climb away with practiced grace. Somewhere inside it, systems were holding balance, trimming automatically, maintaining stability even if the pilot let go for a moment. The aircraft disappeared into cloud. The co-pilot smiled faintly, not because technology had solved the problem, but because the question was finally being taken seriously. Engineers now spoke openly about graceful degradation, about systems that failed slowly instead of catastrophically, about buying time for humans to re-enter the loop. They were rediscovering, in another language, what one pilot had demonstrated unintentionally over Germany. That survival is not about never losing control. It is about ensuring that when control is lost, the fall is not immediate. The bomber had not fallen because its pilot had left the machine in a state that could tolerate his absence. That truth had echoed forward through decades of design, debate, and disaster, even when no one remembered its origin. As the co-pilot turned away from the runway for the last time, the mystery that framed the entire story finally narrowed to a single, unavoidable point. The bomber didn't fall because of what happened after the pilot died. It didn't fall because of what happened before. And now, with only one part left to tell, the story stood ready to close the loop, to reveal completely and without ambiguity, the meaning that had been waiting since the opening question. Because the final truth was not about aircraft at all. It was about what humans choose to leave behind. And that led to the last question of all. When the moment comes that you are no longer there to intervene, will what you prepare be stable enough to carry others forward, or will it demand control that no one can give? The answer had been there from the beginning, hidden in plain sight, waiting patiently for the noise of war and memory to fade enough to hear it clearly. On October 14, 1943, at 23,000 feet over Germany, the bomber did not defy physics. It did not rely on luck miracles or unseen hands in the sky. It did something far more unsettling. It simply continued doing exactly what it had been prepared to do. When German fighters killed the pilot, they removed the human wolf from the cockpit, but they did not remove the last decision he had made. The trim was set. The power was balanced. The aircraft was neutral, stable, honest. In that brief window before chaos, the pilot had unknowingly created a machine that did not need him for a few precious minutes. Those minutes were everything. They were enough for the bomber to resist falling, enough for the crew to realize something was wrong, enough for the co-pilot to step into a role that otherwise would have vanished with the aircraft. The bomber didn't survive because someone saved it in the final second. It survived because someone prepared it before the final second ever arrived. That was the truth hinted at in the beginning. The reason the aircraft didn't plunge when every rule said it should. The pilot did not predict his death. He did not plan to be removed from the equation. He simply flew correctly, thoroughly, responsibly, leaving behind a system that could tolerate his absence for a short while. War rarely rewards foresight so quietly. History rarely notices it at all. The co-pilot lived long enough to understand that what he had witnessed was not a miracle story. It was a warning disguised as survival. It revealed how thin the margin really was between catastrophe and continuity, and how often that margin was decided long before danger announced itself. In the years that followed, as aircraft became more complex and automation took over tasks once handled by human hands, the lesson only grew more relevant. Machines learned to hold altitude, heading balance, but they still depended on the intentions set into them beforehand. When humans vanished from the loop, through overload, confusion, or failure, the machine did not improvise. It obeyed, just as the bomber had. The final realization, the one that tied every part of the story together, was not about aviation or war or technology. It was about responsibility. Responsibility does not end at the moment you lose control. It begins earlier, when you decide how much control will be needed later. The pilot's last adjustment mattered not because he died, but because he had done his job well enough that others could survive without him. That was the quiet heroism no medal could capture. And that is why the bomber didn't fall. Not because gravity failed, not because fate intervened, but because preparation outlived presence. When German fighters killed a pilot at 23,000 feet, the bomber stayed in the air long enough to prove something most people never want to confront. That survival is often decided before the crisis begins. That the most important decision you make may be the one you never get to see the result of. And that when you're suddenly gone, what you leave behind will either collapse immediately or carry others forward, just long enough to matter. That is a truth that waited until the end to be revealed. And that is why the bomber didn't fall. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or any other place? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure that real heroes does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen